Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Friday discussion group. Today we have our friend Stephen Petter, and he will introduce himself and what he's talking about when he feels ready.
Well, I'm calling it the effects on parenthood of wartime evacuation. I'm sure you've all heard of Guernica. Guernica occurred on April the 28th, 1937. I was born a week or so later. I think that might be relevant to some aspects of particularly my father's behavior. But I'll start with my mother. My mother was a very intelligent woman from a family with 7 brothers living in a poky little house in Walthamstow, East London. Her father was, you might say, upper working class, lower middle class. The family politics were apathetic, slightly Tory. She managed to get to the girls' grammar school, and she got lots of good general certificate, whatever they were called in those days, general certificate education. And she escaped and got a job in the city of London, actually in the Prue, and she lived in Bloomsbury, which had a cachet. Although the heyday of the Bloomsbury set was over, she got excitement for the fact she was living in that area. And what most interested her was she met real communists and put an exclamation mark after it. In fact, she got well in with them and was due to go to Moscow on some sort of sponsored trip. But she fell pregnant, which you will all know was a pretty awful thing to do in the late 1930s. She would have been totally disgraced and rejected by her family. She would have been treated as a fallen woman, and her child would probably have been taken away from her and adopted and sent to Australia or something. Now, my father, Jim, was from, you might call, upper middle class. Although he was an industrialist, so he wasn't an aristocrat, but he was upper class. And his mother was a Plymouth Brethren, which meant that he grew up with a very, very strong principles of honesty and decency and that. But he rejected his family, or his family rejected him. His father was angry when he started wearing pink shirts, was worried when he started reading Dickens, and furious when he started, he threw him out of the family when he started reading Marx. And he tried very hard to be working class. He became an active trade unionist and socialist. He took me on the first CND march. And in the late 30s, when Hitler was coming to power, he was very, very anti-fascist. The only people who were anti-fascist in those days were the Communist Party. So he joined them briefly, but left in disgust when he discovered that didn't know whether they were going to be on the German side or the British side. They had to wait for what Moscow told them which side they were on. So he promptly left the Communist Party. And although he hated uniforms and flag flapping and royalty and saluting and all that sort of stuff, he joined the Royal Navy Reserve. He was, as I say, very high principled, but I would think possibly you could say emotionally incompetent. He, like many Edwardians, he couldn't express love and affection. He expressed it by taking us on long walks in Epping Forest. He expressed it when we were apart by writing long, long, beautiful letters, which we as small children could read because he wrote them all in capitals and clear letters. He was very public spirited, both with local neighbors, helping them fix their machines and so on. And politically, he was secretary of a very large union branch. And on the Walthamstow Trades Council. Now, I mentioned Guernica because I was born around about the time of the Spanish Civil War. And I think he would have gone to it had he not had his, oh yeah, well, I haven't mentioned what happened. So he came across, I don't know how, my mother, a damsel in distress, pregnant, in a terrible state, and married her. Now, whether he married her because he fell in love with her, and she was actually very good looking, or whether he did it so because he felt, as one does, here's a need, I'm capable of filling it, I've got no option but to do it. You want to question me in the discussion afterwards, whether you think that's a valid line of reasoning. But anyway, whether or not he did, he married her. And it wasn't really a marriage set in the stars, because they were very different in many of their attitudes and things. Nevertheless, they had me, only she had me, no. And then they had another child, my sister Rosemary. Well, now, they were very frightened of war. My father had very bad experiences as a schoolboy in the First World War. Apparently, he was pretty well starved. And Guernica, the bombing of a city by a massive air force. There were all sorts of novels. I read the novel by Neville Shute about it. And people feared widespread cholera. They thought the bombs would burst the drains and everybody would die of cholera. And so there's an enormous program of evacuation. You must have heard of children being sent out to the country, evacuated from the cities. There was also a huge number of children sent abroad. The Petter family decided to send all their children to stay with an uncle, Uncle Ernest, or Sir Ernest Petter. He'd been a very successful industrialist in Britain, in Yeovil, basically. And he had retired and got himself a large house in British Columbia, Canada. And so, under the care of my father's twin sister, and by the way, when I refer to my father, I refer to Jim Petter. His sister Agnes, his twin sister Agnes, was a lovely, lovely person. And she had care of this huge swarm of kids out in the far corner of Canada. It must have been a very difficult life for her. She once caught us playing hopscotch on the well cover, which must have terrified her. I once played with matches and burnt my coat and hid it. And when it was discovered, it denied all knowledge. And she took me out for a beating. She had a big wooden spoon and she led me out of the house and told me she was going to give me a beating, not for burning your coat, but for telling lies. And I think that made a strong impression on me. Funnily enough, I can't actually remember the beating. So we had a lovely time in Canada with all my cousins and so on, and living near the woods and the pond where we built another child built a raft, poked across the pond, and we used to go to the beach quite frequently. But all good things came to an end, and it was decided we all had to go home. So I don't remember much of my life up to that period, but I do remember being on a train going through the Rockies and going through the plains of Canada, and we got stopped in Toronto waiting for a convoy. Now, this goes back chronologically a little bit because I'm going to go back to my journey out to Canada. I didn't go with Aunt Agnes. I was given into the care of a woman called Nora Idians, who I think must have been a sort of a servant or some sort of acquaintance. And she was taking her son out to Canada. And so they got her to take me. And I discovered very late in life, she said, I went to collect you and your mother thrust Rosemary into my arms and didn't even give me any nappies. So Rosemary and I went to Canada, and this lady, Nora, who I met, as I say, many years later, said she couldn't understand why we were not in a convoy. This is going out to Canada. Years later, she read that our ship, a Royal Navy cruiser, went alone across the Atlantic at very high speed, too fast for submarines to torpedo, because it was carrying most of Britain's gold reserves and financial stocks. These were going to be stored in Montreal. Montreal was going to be the capital if the royal family had to go into exile, they were going to go to Montreal. This is another thing from my memoirs. Our voyage took place a few days after one in which a ship carrying many child evacuees was torpedoed. The ship was used as an evacuee ship to transport 90 children from Britain to Canada. The ship was torpedoed and sunk in September 1940 by a German submarine, with the loss of many, many people and 77 of the children. This sinking caused such a public outrage in Britain that it led to Winston Churchill cancelling the plan, which was to relocate thousands of children abroad. But on the journey out, by the way, my mother wasn't included. When it was clear that war was ending, we had to wait in Toronto for a convoy, and we were put onto an aircraft carrier. Now I'm spending a bit too long on this history stuff, aren't I? It was an empty aircraft carrier, a newly built aircraft carrier with no planes and no pilots, but it was just being sent from America to Britain for the war. And I had a delightful time on this ship. The sailors were very tender-hearted to this blue-eyed, fair-haired little boy of 7, and they allowed me to work the guns, real guns, turning the handles to swivel the gun up and down and round and round. And life was good on the ship, except that my poor aunt kept on getting ticked off by the captain, because we were all supposed to keep our life jackets on us all the time, and I kept on losing mine. And my poor aunt got, one night we were all taken up to a certain room and told there was an attack. We were being attacked. The convoy was under attack. And the captain came in and he saw I hadn't got my life belt. He roared at my aunt, "That child is without his life jacket." Poor Aunt Agnes. When we got to England, to Liverpool, everything was so different. Liverpool was grim. Everything seemed grey. We saw a boy walking by with no shoes on, which amazed us. We got to Walthamstow, my mother's home that she grew up in, and there was several houses at the top of the road had been knocked down. The bomb crater was still in the middle of the road. And my mother, she was so unlike Aunt Agnes. Rosemary accidentally hurt the new baby. And mother was very, very strict with her, very strict, and horrified me. Well, the worst part of the story is that I was an abused child. My mother beat me up pretty well non-stop for 7 years, really, or even longer. She would lose her temper. She would bash me, mostly on the upper arms. So I had bruises continuously. I would have one arm being bashed, and then I would sort of turn around to let the other arm have a turn. So it was a very, very miserable life. She made me do lots of shopping, which practically dragged my arms out of their armpits. And she showed a lot of favoritism to the 3 new babies she'd had. So Rosemary and I used to have to do all the chores and stuff, and the other girls got off. I mean, even having to wear a napkin at meal times, which was humiliating for me. the younger sisters didn't have to. And there was the good thing of that period of my life was my aunts, particularly Agnes and the other aunt called Margaret, used to invite me for the whole of Easter holidays and summer holidays. So I got away from home to this totally different environment of a calm, quiet, polite, middle-class life, where everything went quietly by clockwork and everybody was kind and charming to each other, and they lived in a big house in the country. And I grew up with Aunt Margaret's two children, who, because they went to boarding school, I was at home almost as much as they were. So I grew up with this strange double life, which I think has done me good in a way. It means I kind of mix with everybody, even if only at a shallow level. Now, after my mother died, she'd made me executor of her will, and I went through her papers and I found she wrote a letter to Jim, her husband. Stephen and Rosemary have returned from Canada, and I find I've lost all affection for them. She wasn't only nasty to me, she was also nasty to Jim, her husband. He tried to protect us, and being a pacifist, well, you know, he'd been in the Navy, but he didn't believe in violence. He tried to interject himself between her and me or Rosemary. And then she would try to shove him out of the way, and they'd end up wrestling. And I've even seen them rolling on the floor wrestling once, which is not a nice sight for a child to see. And when Jim died, she turned on her brother, who was always an inoffensive chap who always sat in the corner, Uncle Bert. And she would criticize him horribly. So when Bert died, I thought, oops, it's my turn. It's my turn next. But by then she was pretty old and feeble, and I used to visit her on Saturdays and take her out for a spin in the car and take her to Epping Forest, which she absolutely loved. And one day, one of my sisters said to me, I don't understand why you're so nice to Mummy. The horrible things she says about you. So I realized, yes, I was following in Jim's and Bert's position. Now, getting serious though, other cousins with whom I am still in contact, all had big troubles with their parents, with their mothers, after being evacuated in Canada. And I know that the, what would you call them, family psychologists or something, that social care people, they wouldn't do that nowadays. And I do feel I have sort of forgiven my mother. I do feel sympathy for her. Here was a woman who managed to escape from a horrible, pokey, possibly incestuous home. There were all dark hints about that. And got away, got to a new exciting time in London, living in Bloomsbury, meeting exciting people. And suddenly sort of brought down by me, by being pregnant to me, of me, to a life of drudgery with 5 kids and not a generous income, and a husband who was very high principled, always often doing good works in the left-wing area, or helping the neighbors mend their sewing machines or their mowing machines, but emotionally unable to express any sort of kindness or sympathy, except, as I say, through letters and things. He wrote wonderful letters. When he was dying in Bart's Hospital, I was working nearby. I was able to pop in every morning to do a couple of personal little jobs for him. And one day he managed to say to me, Stephen, you're a decent chap. And that was the most loving thing he ever managed to say. It's very sad, really. And I just finished by saying, when I was doing an OU course in sociology, we were doing personality traits, and we had a great list of personality traits. And I, being the sort of chap I am, get bored very quickly. I put 2 columns beside these traits: mum, dad, and all the traits I think I'm pleased I've got. I ticked either mum or dad. And to my surprise, most of the things I think are good about myself, I attribute to my mother. But I don't think if there was another war, I don't think people would be evacuated to the extent they were in the Second World War. And that's all I have to say. Well, let's have questions and discussion. Thank you for listening. What's the time? Oh, how fast.
Yeah.
Jim,
Well,
interesting.
yes. Thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, I'd quite like to know quite a lot of things more. How did you? You talked about you got yourself a job in the city. How did you? What led you to do that? What kind of job was it?
That she got, my mother got.
No, you. After you grew up.
Oh, well, I didn't mention that, except that I said I worked near St. Bart's Hospital, didn't I? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
I've had a wonderful life, and I was a programming contractor, which meant I traveled a lot to lots of interesting places. And there was a time when I was doing some programming for St. Bart's Hospital, and actually it was they have a pool of nurses available. They call it the bank. Well, this was sort of processing the bank so that a sister could just type in a few words and up would come the name of a suitable nurse. That job only lasted a few months, as that often happens with contracting. As a contractor, you get very high pay, but no perks whatsoever, no holidays, no sick benefit, and so on. But that's about me. I was talking more about my mum and the relationship. Sure. Her job was at the Prue. The job that she got in London was at the big Prue offices.
It's quite a big thing to get a job, there at all, I would have imagined.
Yeah. Yes. From a young woman from the East End, that was pretty clever of her.
Yeah.
Jim, nice to see you here. You can ask questions as well as you wish. Jim is my son. Jim, in the bottom right corner, he's my son.
Hello. Dad left a note saying he was going to be talking about this, so I thought I'd just have a listen. I'm going to have to go fairly soon because I've got quite a bit of work on. But I think Guernica, I didn't realise how big an impact Guernica had actually, and I think Guernica was the first time there'd been a massive aerial bombardment, and I think I kind of see how that it affected the public psyche on the possibility of mass bombings and what that might cause and the sort of nightmare scenario. I mean, nowadays we think of it as being sort of part of most wars and understand it a bit better, but I guess at the time it was a sort of futuristic nightmarish concept. So I can imagine why people would have been worried. And I once spoke to your mum, Dad, about you guys going off to Canada, and she said, I said, why did you send them off? I probably didn't handle it very sensitive when I asked her because I was only a kid, but she said it was really frowned upon not to send your kids off. So you were felt to be almost committing your kids to be obliterated if you didn't send them off. So there was a massive social pressure to send your kids away, particularly from central London, and that it would have been incredibly irresponsible not to. There were some people who just wouldn't, and actually they got on. I mean, assuming they survived the Blitz, they got on okay, and in many ways emotionally probably got on better. But there was a hell of a lot of pressure at that time, not to have your kids around for what was coming, and Guernica added to that.
Well, actually, if you take my wife, your mum's case, she stayed in London in south on the South Bank. I've forgotten the name of the town now, and Streatham, and she was bombed twice. And although she wasn't physically damaged, it affected her horribly for the rest of her life. She had sort of agoraphobia and excessive nervousness about all sorts of things. So she was a victim of the war.
Yeah, good.
You know, she wasn't a
Yeah.
statistic.
Mm.
Thanks for coming.
Just, I suppose, you know, the effects of war and how they go on through the generations, really.
Yeah.
The more subtle effects.
Yeah. Other questions? Comments? Yes, Susan.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Sorry, this is general. It's about my parents actually. My mother was evacuated in the first evacuation. Her whole school was evacuated. They went wood from Leighton, which really near where it was from, and her mother was so desperately missing her, and she was so desperately missing her mother. She came back. She was summoned back fairly quickly and stayed throughout the war. But it was very heavy. My father, who was 18 at the beginning of the war, but had health problems, so couldn't sight problems, so he's working from. Well, he was working actually in evacuation patients, amongst other things. But they were regularly bombed out, you know, from having. He'd go to work and then he'd go to a shelter at night to sort of support people bombed out, and he'd come home in the morning. He'd never know whether he'd the house or not, because he was bombed out several times during the war. Really. So it was very heavy. I did think people always thought that the ones who were evacuated to Canada or to America had a really lovely time of it, because of course it wasn't so lovely for lots of reasons. Why did your mother not go with the children? Because she would have been, that she could. I mean, you would have been of an age when she could have gone with you.
Yeah. I think she was never properly accepted by the Petter family. In fact, I think my father broke off. I gather that he married Marjorie without actually telling his mother, and that caused a rift in the family. And he never spoke to his brother again for the rest of their lives over that.
You mentioned the words filling a need at one point, and it made me think that you must have had quite a strong moral perspective on life from quite an early age. Would you say you got that from your mother, or was it something within yourself?
I think it was all both of them and my aunt. They all had a very high regard for honesty and decency and public service and that sort of thing. Or not so much my mother public service, but public obligation, being a decent neighbour. She was always going around picking up other people's litter because, you know, she felt a sense of responsibility. And which used to drum into, supposing everybody did it. Supposing that was her rationale for ethics, really.
Just had another, which has never occurred to me, as to why my keen to get my mother, and that was because she was the only one who wasn't old enough. Or she had 7 siblings who all were involved with it, and she was the only one left in the country, essentially. So, and I imagine that was also an issue for those who'd got large families, that while they had the lost children through evacuation, they had also had lots of war effort. It must have been a dreadful time for everybody, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as Jim says, the effects pass down through the generations.
Yeah. Well, it's why people are pacifists, isn't it? Because war is so utterly horrible. It's almost indescribable in so many ways, not just the battlefield, but for the families and for everybody. Yeah.
It must have been an awful shock, actually, coming from a relatively comfortable existence in Canada. You know, the rationing and so on when you got to Britain.
No bananas.
No.
Yeah, it was a horrible shock. And the house we lived in was no help because it was a poky, horrible, dark house, an unhappy house. Mm-hmm.
But it was a dark period, wasn't it, after the war? You know, the first few years after the war were very dark. But,
Graham.
I think most children's experience of evacuation was not as damaging as Stephen's was. My question is to what extent he and his sister were able to keep in touch with their parents through letters, photographs perhaps, with the postal service across the Atlantic. Most children, of course, were evacuated to another place in the countryside of this country, where there was still better means of maintaining contact with parents, so it would not be as big a shock to the parents when larger, more obstreperous children came back home at the end of the war.
I don't really recollect. I must have had letters from my parents when we were in Canada, but I don't recollect. The only thing I do recollect is we went to, there was an airfield was being built nearby in Canada, and we got on a visit to the radio station there, and we were given a microphone and sort of broadcast to our friends' mums and dads at home, sort of thing. No, I don't remember any mail or any contact. Of course, you couldn't telephone or anything. It's far too expensive. No, I don't remember much of that. And I've mentioned that other cousins of mine had difficulties with their parents. One mother came out with her children and then sort of didn't like it in Canada and went back, leaving her children in the care of my aunt Agnes. And that girl and her sister both have had troubled adulthoods. It's a lack of commitment. It does something to your psychology if you're separated from your parents. So I've always had a bit of a problem with commitment, which is probably why I'm a single bloke living on my own.
I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid.
All right. Well, nice of you to come, Jim. All the best.
Yeah.
Bye.
Cheers. Nice to see you all. Bye.
Yes, you reminded me of something from my childhood when I was about 8, and my closest sister was 6. The 2-year-old sister was, had pneumonia and had to go into hospital. And my mother went and visited, every day, I mean, nowadays she'd have been allowed to stay in, but, and she said it was years later that she realized that we'd been really jealous that, our sister was getting all the attention and we weren't. And I think it's one of the things that, you know, children and adults can so often be seeing the same thing in totally different ways.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know, I mean, that's nothing like you. It's just that we picked up on this sister when, you know, once she came home, and you know, mother couldn't understand it for quite some time, and then suddenly, you know.
The children can't communicate, because I've observed amongst my grandchildren, when their parents have been away and come back, the children throw a strop. They find something and they start screaming and bawling over not having a biscuit or something. But I've seen it as expressing anger at their parents for having gone away. And you think even amongst adults, you know, if somebody says, I'm going to be in at 6 and they don't come in till 7, your first reaction is anger before it goes back to being loving, doesn't it? So I've watched my grandchildren screaming and bawling and thinking they're trying to tell you, but what I have learned is not to tell my kids how to bring up their kids. That's us for trouble.
Yeah. Yes, I suppose you were very lucky, in fact, that that you actually went away with, you know, cousins and that, so that you were in a you weren't going, you know, as a stranger amongst strangers so much.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
But you know, that doesn't make the homecoming any easier, does it?
No, it doesn't.
No, well,
I had psychosomatic illness. It was very interesting. When I used to go stay for a holiday with Aunt Margaret, and it came towards the end of the holidays and I was due to go back home, I would genuinely get ill. I would raise the temperature. And Aunt Margaret had a rule: you stay in bed until your temperature's gone down or something, or until your temperature's been gone down for a day or something. So quite frequently messages were flashed back and forth. Stephen's ill, he can't come home. And only in hindsight, I realized it must have been psychosomatic. Anyway, we don't have to stay here if we've got no more questions. David, do you want to ask anything or tell us about your war experience? And Susan has raised her hand, so David's not responding. So Susan.
I just, because I'm unclear about chronology.
Yeah.
My understanding is you came back in 1940 and you've got a younger sister and you were still of school age. And then there were more children there. And did you all stay in Walthamstow for the next 5 years?
No,
and if so, what happened about school?
It was a bit more complex than that, but I didn't think it was very relevant.
Yeah.
When we first came back, we went to Liverpool and Hoe Street, which was a miserable station, and Walthamstow, and to that horrid home that she'd grown up in. Then we moved to a house out in Hertfordshire. But then the owner of that came back from the war, and then we had to move back to the house in Walthamstow, where we stayed for quite a long time till we got a council house. In fact, we were due to go to Australia. We'd all passed all the tests for the £10 emigration to Australia. But my mother was getting increasingly frustrated living in this little house. It's a terraced house in Waltham. It's a very common sort of thing. And we finally came up for a council house. So she insisted we move to this council house, which must have been another major disappointment for my father, really, because he'd been looking forward. He'd got a job in Melbourne, Australia. So we moved to this rather nice council house because it was tucked into Epping Forest, which we all loved. And that's where I had most of my childhood. And as for the 1940, now I'm not good on dates, but no, we went out in 1940 and we came back in must have been 1945. I don't understand why we came back while the war was still on and the ship was attacked by submarines. That seems really bizarre to me. I've never been told why we came back early before the end of the war. I actually saw doodlebugs and things flying over. I mean, it was all quite exciting when you're a boy. I have written all this up in my memoirs, and this is all part one of my memoirs. So if anybody wants a nice boring read, they can ask me for my memoirs.
Well, I would hope you can try to get them published, Stephen.
Well, they need editing, actually. They're a bit long-winded. I'm not very good at cutting out the unnecessary detail, I'm afraid. But volume one, I mean, part one, which is my childhood, is fairly concise. Yeah, I'm quite happy to publish them. Whether anybody ever read them. Sarah, my girlfriend, who's died, she was quite scornful. Nobody will ever read them, you know. And she saw it just as self-aggrandizement, rather like taking selfies.
Graham, you had a question.
Well, I was just going to make the point that towards the end of the war, it was assumed that mass bombing of cities by the Germans would not take place again, so that England was a much safer country in which to live than it was in 1940. Whether the doodlebugs and the V2s were predicted, I don't know. Valerie has been listening with interest to Stephen's talk, and she wants to point out that there's a possibility, perhaps the likelihood, that all the Ukrainian refugees, mothers and children, who have come to other countries in Europe and been separated from their fathers, who are continuing to fight in Ukraine, will suffer the same kind of problems that Stephen had in the relationship with his father.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite possible.
Yeah, I was thinking of that too, and you know, the flattening of parts of Ukraine by the bombing, a bit like the flattening of the East End, and then later by us, of course, our flattenings of various German cities.
Yeah, and then Hiroshima. Yeah, it just begs. I think most people can't comprehend how utterly awful war is. You know, I was absolutely horrified, absolutely staggered by the enormity of the evil of it.
I think in some respects we're lucky if we're old enough, even if only a small amount remains in our memory. I mean, I'm 78, so I barely remember, but it's very immediate in my mind because my parents would be talking about it and my relatives would talk about it, and we were always very interested in school and pretending we were doodlebugs and things, you know, even though that was then in the immediate past. So I feel very connected and to what happened and how people felt, and horror, the absolute horror and devastation, and I think that's a good thing to be aware of, because I think we must have a lot of people who really don't understand what, you know, mass bombing does actually entail, what it's like and what it means for people. So I think in a sense we're lucky to have that, especially if it's just as a sort of bit of a folk memory rather than a direct memory. I don't know.
Yes, but let's hope it gets pushed into history. You know, there's the Holocaust and the Crusades and things like that. They're history now.
Yeah.
For goodness sake, war needs to get into the same state. It needs to be something of the past. Won't happen in my lifetime, but hopefully within a couple of generations, war will be no more.
Yes, I can remember. You're mentioning bananas reminded me of a story, something my grandmother told me, that because my mother and uncle were children when the war started, and you know, and her sister, they had a greengrocer's shop, and my grandmother asked, you know, if they could have a couple of oranges to put in the stockings, which would have, you know, broken the rationing rules. And her sister said no. And I think, you know, led to a lot of coldness. Yeah, and it is often little things like that that do really rankle with people, isn't it?
Yes, I remember having stockings in the toe of my Christmas stocking, having oranges in the toe of my Christmas stocking.
Yeah.
It was an absolute delight.
Yeah.
My mother was very moralistic about the black market because she knew the black market was going on. You know, we can't get any meat this week, and then she would vituperate against the black marketeers because that was part of the reason there were shortages, is because the black market was thriving. She was very moralistic about that. The other thing both my parents were very moralistic about was anti-Semitism. We used to have a fascist in the high street, and they taught me an absolute horror of anti-Semitism. About the most disgusting thing you can do, sort of thing. It's quite interesting how parents can impress you in various ways.
Yes, I know it's one of the reasons that if I go to a Catholic or an Orthodox church, you know, as soon as the Virgin Mary is mentioned, my hackles go up. And I know my aunt, you know, who was the vicar's wife at Sunday school, explained to me why we don't, you know, worship her like other people do. And it's obviously stuck and it's there, and I, you know, can't get rid of it. But, you know, not that I actually want to, because of course Quakers, you know, well, we won't get into that because that'll get Stephen onto one of his hobby horses. So,
my dad used to sing a song. Apparently, they used to sing as they traipsed off to church on a Sunday, and they passed a different church, and they would sing, "We are the men of God, we are the chosen few. There's hardly space in heaven, there'll be no room for you."
Oh, lovely.
Right. Well, I think if nobody else has got any questions, it falls to me, as Ray's not here, to say thank you to Stephen. It's been a very interesting talk and discussion, and I think we can, you know, we'll have to think of other bits of your life that we can hear about.
Plunder.
Yeah, I'm slightly sorry that we didn't meet any of your sisters, but you know, probably better for you that we didn't. But anyway, yeah. Right, and would Patsy like to remind us who we've got next week, because I've forgotten.
So have I. I'm really, really sorry, everybody. And it's because of my incompetence that I can't get into the bit of my computer where I've got the list.
Right, okay, so
I'm really sorry.
we've got something next week.
We do have something next week.
I think it's Jenny Smith.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's great. Well,
Bye, everybody.
No, I've
Thanks for
got
having
her down as the 30th, as the end of the month.
Yeah.
Oh, right. So who have we got for next week?
But I haven't got the 23rd. But then it has all changed anyway, hasn't it?
Anyway, I think I'll leave you now. Goodbye.
Yeah,
It's lovely
okay,
to meet
bye,
you all.
Stephen. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Oh, David. Oh, thumbs up. Okay, thumbs up. Thank you, David.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, should we not worry about what we've got next week, because we'll probably all be
My
there.
diary says the Bamford community.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
What is it?
The Bamford community, Quaker
Oh,
community.
yes, yes. I hope they get back to me soon. They're meant to be sending me some stuff ahead, which I haven't got yet. But I'm sure they will be
Yeah.
with us.
I, as I said, I recommended it after I went to the special interest group at the yearly meeting, and I just thought, it's fascinating how the community's adapted over the years and how they're adapting now. So,
They sounded very enthusiastic when I spoke to them, so
yeah,
should be
right.
good.
Okay. Bye for
Okay.
now.
Very much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you.